So it's hard to believe it's November already. So welcome, everyone. Did everybody have the opportunity to review the minutes from October? Okay, so any corrections, additions, any comments? Okay, can I see a motion to approve? All right, terrific. So we're going to approve meeting minutes from October 19th, 2020. Thank you very much. Okay, Marie, would you like to provide the health officer's report?
Sure. Good evening. I'll start off with health first. Right now, inspections are still going on, both in codes and in health. There's one board member who's up for reappointment this year, so I just need to know if they're interested in being reappointed, and that's Mr. Karate, so I think I'm just waiting to hear back from him. One of our past student interns back in 2018 wishes to connect with one of the physicians on the board. I think she has some interest in medical school and was hoping to reach out to somebody to have a conversation. So if anybody is interested in that, if I can forward her contact information to you, she's just waiting to hear back from somebody. The Board of Commissioners extended the outdoor dining and retail. It's the temporary that we put out back when the pandemic started. They approved that to be extended through March 31st, even though I guess that will change eventually soon. And they extended the date for the picnic grove over there on North Wayne Avenue through the end of this month, November 30th. Delaware County is, I think I forwarded to you all, is offering free COVID testing. If you go to delcopa.gov and look up information on testing, it'll tell you the locations there. It's walk up and it's free to Delaware County residents. No prescription is required, and it's the PCR test. The American Red Cross is hosting a blood drive over in the Radnor Activity Center this week, Thursday and Friday. There's still time to sign up. You can just go to radnor.com, and it's open to anybody. It's one of the first community blood drives in Radnor, so they're looking forward to kind of getting this site up and running on a regular basis. You can just go to radnor.com and follow the link, and then you can sign up there. A little bit about the Zoom meetings, especially going forward. So I spoke with John Rice, and there's no meeting of the board off the record. So every time the group comes together, it's considered township business. So it has to follow all the protocols in the code. So there has to be an agenda, somebody has to be taking minutes, and recording is optional, but all the other stuff kind of has to take place. Even if there's no vote or anything. Once you all decide to come together, you're considered doing township business. So just going forward, we'll just have to follow that protocol. A little bit on OEM. We amended the staff protocols on the 29th of October. Basically, what we added in there was just explaining how important it is to report any signs or symptoms, any positive testing to your supervisor, who will then in turn notify OEM. We also talked a little bit about the definition of, what defines a close contact. We are also meeting fairly often. There may be some changes with the township operation over the next few days. Just to give you a heads up, if there are any changes, I'll make sure I forward those to you all. Everything's related to the increase in cases. And then I guess finally, the Delaware County held a Zoom press conference on November 12th on on the COVID update, and you can find that actually just on there today. You can go to delcopa.gov and go under the latest news, and it'll give you a write-up, and you can actually watch the video of the press conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. I did have the opportunity to look at the press conference over the weekend. It was excellent, so I would encourage the public, definitely. It was very informative. There was physicians and representatives from Delaware County and Chester County, so it was extremely helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. You sent us actually a link in in the email that you sent on Friday. And if people held that, you can just click that link and get there. And I am not going to cover, when I talk, the locals, because I think they did such a stupendous job of covering what's going on in Delaware County, and I heartily recommend that people have a look. Because it wasn't good on Thursday, and it's 4 days later, and it's not better now. So I heartily recommend people do that. And I had a couple of questions. You brought up Zoom meeting. I wonder whether we should start thinking now about whether or not the next meeting of this body should be a Zoom meeting. And I don't know that we need to make that decision now, but if things continue the way they are, it might be a well-advised decision. And then I had one other question, and that was about, you mentioned outdoor dining. What's the current status in Radnor on indoor dining?
So I know that's going to change in the next day or so.
How about never mind then?
So right now, if restaurants self-certified, they're able to bump up to 50% occupancy indoor. Outdoor is a little bit different. If there's no tent, they can just space their tables out 6 feet apart, keep clearance for pedestrians walking down the street. But there seems to be some significant changes coming. As far as the Zoom meeting is concerned, again, I'll just mention the Township and the OEM are talking about changing the operation here as far as public coming in. So that would, as soon as I hear anything, I will make sure that I will let the board know, what the plan is as far as meetings and et cetera.
Thank you, Dr. Simmons. That's a good point. So I fully support whatever the Township decides, so more to come on that. So I think it's an evolving issue right at the moment. Things are changing by the hour, we know, in the city, and I'm sure some decisions will be happening here as well. So thank you for that update, Marie. Okay, student interns, Dr. Carabassi.
Yes, the student interns have a presentation that they'd like to present on their preliminary project. If you guys want to come up, or can you do it from there? Or probably not, right?
So for the student intern project this year, Tricia and I wanted to focus on a topic that is very commonly talked about, mental health, but we wanted to talk about it in regards to teens and how it's taught and talked about in Radnor health classes. So just some quick statistics. So if we look at how mental health has been changing over the years in America, a study by researchers at Johns Hopkins University examined national trends in 12-month prevalence of depressive episodes, and the rate of adolescents experiencing major depression surged nearly 40% from 2005 to 2014. And according to the WHO, 50% of all mental health conditions start by 14 years of age, but most of these cases are undetected or untreated. And if we look at this graph, we can see that cases of depression, anxiety, and behavior disorders have also risen in prevalence over the years, and especially between the 12 to 17 age group. And all these statistics show that the need for mental health education and early prevention regarding how to deal with these depressive episodes, anxiety, and behavior disorders is really needed. And then if we look at Radnor students, we can see those same trends. So this is from the PACE survey in 2017. And Radnor students reported higher rates of depressed feelings than those surveyed in 2011. And we can see how much the points went up for grades 6, 8, 10, and 12. And this was part of the Greater Radnor Wellness Study.
Okay, so with this data in mind, we arrived at the thesis that Radnor High School's focus on mental health is commendable because the state of Pennsylvania does have fairly loose guidelines for their mental health education curriculum as compared to a state like New York. There are still improvements to be made specifically in the delivery of that information to our students in the most effective and applicable way.
So for why we need to talk about mental health education specifically in Radnor High School, so with just a simple Google search on mental health education in classrooms, there's a plethora of information on how important it is to talk about it and how important it is to discuss it, but exactly how it should be effectively implemented and made relatable to teens isn't really discussed. Well, I'm sure that we could find further research on it, but it's not readily talked about. And just based on our personal experience in Radnor, after the health classes every year, we would have a survey talking about things that we wanted to change about the health classes or any issues that we had in regards to how the classes were taught. And I noticed that a lot of students shared the sentiment that health classes, when we talked about mental health issues, they were not really focused on discussion and interacting with each other, but more didactic and less relatable.
Okay, so we did want to give you some context as to what we wanted to do exactly and what we're learning now in our high school classes. So we wanted to normalize discussion about mental illness and focus less on extreme cases like schizophrenia, for example, which can further stigmatize a young mind's idea of mental illness. And we wanted to talk about things teenagers more commonly face currently, like depression and anxiety. And we wanted to talk about how poor mental health can derive from stress of school and the environment, especially in a school like Radnor that harbors a lot of pressure to meet high expectations and good grades and getting into college. We wanted to engage in more active dialogue as opposed to passively watching videos, many of which are outdated, so that does make it harder to resonate with. And then we also want to talk about mental health in 9th grade, and the current 9th grade curriculum per the Radnor Program of Studies is responsible decision-making, peer pressure, resistance skills, emotions, and conflict resolution. So these are just tools to help you navigate through high school, and it would be more effective if we placed talk of mental health in that grade as well. And then lastly, we wanted to emphasize the role of social media and how that plays a part in our mental health and the deterioration of it with the delivery of false information and maybe body and beauty standards, so unrealistic expectations that people think they have to look or be a certain way. So we wanted to talk to our health teachers and guidance counselors to evaluate the way mental health is currently being taught. So for our health teachers, we wanted to ask their opinions on how effectively they think their own curriculum is translating to their students, and if they personally think that there are improvements to be made. And then as for guidance counselors who meet one-on-one with Radnor students, we wanted to generally ask them how often they see students coming to them with problems of mental health, and if they think that these students show like if they're comfortable to talk about it in the classroom, because oftentimes they don't feel comfortable to do so. So to continue with what Tricia was saying, we also are thinking about making an informal focus group of students from our high school to discuss their reactions to previous health education classes. And I know some of my peers have talked about this with me, so I think there are people willing to talk about it if it's allowed. And then we also wanted to survey students from the high school on satisfaction ratings on the mental health teachings in health classes. And then lastly, Suman talked about the post-curriculum surveys that the teachers conduct. So we wanted to see if we could get like teachers to ask students to evaluate in an open-ended format. Or a scale of 1 to 10 on how effective they think that their mental education was. So.
Oh, that was the end. Yeah, that was the
Okay, that's great.
That sounds wonderful. A couple of things. You will need to find a teacher mentor, a counselor mentor, because again, and I've mentioned this before, that in past years, students were not allowed to do surveys, and probably a satisfaction survey would also be included in that. But you never know. You can ask somebody if you would be able to do that. And then after you collect all this information, all this data, what would you then do with it?
I think that with what students are most want to change about the curriculum, we could first share that information with the health teachers, but I'm not sure how much of that curriculum that they're able to change. Even though I know that we're not trying to change the curriculum explicitly, but the way in which it's taught, I think they could change that.
I think if you found flaws and said, hey, look, this is what's going on, and these are what the needs of the students are, this is what they like, this is what they don't like, I'm sure, I mean, that's plenty of information and really so important to share that with the teachers. If you just accomplish that, that would be awesome. Mm-hmm. So I think you have really good ideas.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for putting that together. I know with school and everything going on and how difficult it's been being hybrid and the challenges and putting this together in a week. So you're to be commended, and I think you had some really super great ideas. I think the data was very well presented and looking what's out there and maybe getting a focus group with Dr. Karabassi's guidance and Dr. Duman would be great. So great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just think the next step before you is to find a teacher mentor or counselor mentor, because they'll really be able to help you to accomplish all that you need to accomplish. And just keep me posted, okay? Thanks.
Thank you.
Great work. Okay, so Dr. Simmons has graciously agreed to talk a little bit about COVID-19, and he got some feedback from the board on a couple little subsets that, around COVID. So thank you so much for being willing to talk and present
So I think
this.
you all are being gracious to actually allow me to speak. Are you okay with me going mask down here? Is that okay? And Marie, are we recording? Okay, since we are recording, I think I need to do disclaimers again because there is so much that is politically charged and so much that may or may not be controversial. I am not a virologist, epidemiologist, public health expert, or infectious disease expert. My areas, I am 40 years in the medical care, medical research field, 20 years at Penn, and 7 years in pharmaceutical, and nearly 10 years in devices. The other disclosure is that during my pharmaceutical time, I did work for Pfizer. That will become apparent and relevant. I have no material stake in Pfizer from their point of view or from my point of view, and no material stake in any other companies that we might discuss. So what I wanted to do today, having asked some folks for some feedback, was to try and be a little more focused than last time and discuss some topics that are topical and important, and for which there's a lot of information, but there may be some questions, and it might be of value to spend some time on. Now, the first place I'm going is the New York Times website. I gave you links in the previous presentation to the CDC website, the Johns Hopkins website, the New York Times website, the Pennsylvania website, and the Delaware and Chester County websites. So you can spend your life scrolling through websites and following the data. And I've got to get out of some stuff here. Don't want a financial advisor, and I don't know how to close this thing. I think I close it there. Nope. I apologize. At home, I do subscribe, so I have that. Now, I follow the New York Times website because they have their own consistent, independent approach to gathering the data. They have had great consistency in their data, and they give me the information that I want. And I think it's important to see that we're well over 11.2 million reported cases, and when I spoke with you last time, we're closing in on 30,000 more, 26,000 more cases since we met 28 days, deaths, I should say, since we met 28 days ago. I think that this is an important number, and let's come back to it. The hospitalizations to me, has replaced mortality as the best indicator of where we are in the epidemic, and I'll come back to why I believe that to be true when we get further. This is a map that shows average daily cases per 100,000. I think it's really important. You'll see a lot of maps and charts put up. It's important to know what they're showing. I think that some of the least valuable maps and charts are the total number of cases. Texas had their millionth case. California had their millionth. Okay, but to know what's going on now, you have to have some kind of a denominator, and you have to have some kind of temporality to it. And so this is cases reported in the last week against 14-day running averages, against 100,000 per population, and you can see it is not pretty. There is a dramatic rise in new cases that is going on. You can look at these by cases, by state. You can look at them by where they're going up, where they're going down. You can look at it by fatality by state. And where I usually go to is down here, where these two charts are. And this is new reported cases running the actual number reported on a daily basis. And you can see there's some sawtoothing because the weekends are lower than during the week, but they post it as the curve is as a 7-day average. And the 7-day average of new reported cases is now 150,000, which if you go back to when we were all freaked out, it was 30,000 at the beginning when we saw hospitals filled in cities in Europe and in New York and on the West Coast, 150,000 cases a day. And although, as you can see, the deaths were almost timely with cases early on when it was a novel virus in a naive population, when you got into the summer bump, which, by the way, if you look at cases, the baseline of cases was higher than the peak there, but there's about a 2 to 2.5 week lag between the upturn, about a 2 week lag between the upturn in cases and the upturn in fatalities that occurred during the summer. And if you look now, there's about a 3 week lag between the upturn in cases and the upturn in fatalities. But as I've showed you, the 7-day running average for fatality is now over 1,000. It's actually over 1,100 for the first time since we were back here in the middle of the summer peak. And the delay in that upturn should not be taken as meaning that this is no longer a fatal, vicious virus that is having dramatic effects on the health of individuals and on the public health. Quite the contrary. And I wish I had a spot that had a history of tracking hospitalizations. Hospitalizations are going up. And what has happened is that as we've moved out of the high-density population with a lot of exposure to institutionalized people and workplaces and older populations, and we've moved into a more general population, the fatality rates in the younger folks are lower, but it takes about 2 cycles of viral exposure to get to the more highly vulnerable, more susceptible populations. So the fatality rate is a slower following indicator. The 2 things that I think, if you need indicators in single numbers, the 2 indicators to follow are positivity rates, because total number of cases could be higher or lower depending on how much screening you're doing, how much active testing you're doing, whether or not people are coming to be tested. But even if you're doing a lot of testing or little testing, the positivity rate really tells you how densely the virus is afoot where you are. So what tools do we have to combat this pandemic? And I divided them into 4 categories: public health interventions, which include rational testing, contract tracing, individual quarantines, bubbles, and lockdowns. And if we go back and we look at, if we would go back and think about the chart of cases, when we got serious in the spring, we suppressed the number of new cases. We got lax on Memorial Day, the number of new cases exploded. We got serious again, and it was summertime, and people were out of doors and not indoors, and a number of interventions were taken, and we were able to suppress, but the application of those interventions was maybe not uniform, and we really never did get the baseline down to where it had been between the earliest peak and the summer peak, and it just keeps going up. And we have not fully taken rational control of what we're doing, and let me move on from that, because that could be a black hole that we could go into. Personal health interventions, I have a slide on this coming up, but masks and distancing to prevent respiratory droplet and aerosol exposure, hand washing and fomite avoidance, which have become more important as we've entered the twindemic period of the overlap of seasonal flu epidemic with COVID epidemic, whereas in COVID, fomites are maybe less important, not zero importance, but a lot less important. Aerosol droplets are probably the main mechanism of exposure. Aerosols may or may not be, but aerosol droplets. But now you have to be aware of protecting yourself from both influenza, which we've discussed earlier, is also a potentially fatal disease.
really limiting exposure is your best protection, and that's why there is such a dramatic difference between indoor and outdoor exposure. The number of people in a space, the amount of space you have, how well ventilated it is, and the probability that those people have virus that they are putting into the air in that space are all the factors that contribute to the probability that you will be exposed to a dose of virus that will cause you to be sick and or die. But the place I want to go, because it was requested that we spend time on it, are what are the additional things that may be coming down the line, and what does the news that we have seen mean on both vaccines and on treatments? And the other piece that will fit in there is the notion of herd immunity, which fits in between, I think, vaccines and the epidemiology. So this slide we can come back to if we have time at the end. About you could go over each and every one of the recommendations, but they all have validity in both protecting yourselves, your loved ones, your community, your country, and your fellow human beings from the potential adverse effects of this pandemic. But the things that people really wanted to hear about were vaccines, treatments, and herd immunity. So let's go to them and spend time on them. And one of the things that was raised was the notion of there is some level of uncertainty among people as a consequence of a wide array of things that happened in the public space, in the political space, as to whether or not we can trust the process by which the vaccines are developed. And part of that is that we have Operation Warp Speed, which is part of a network of programs to accelerate vaccine development. And I put this up. This is the National Institutes of Health website. And they have been throughout, they have rigorously adhered to science and data. And you can go on other websites and see what are the ways in which the process of developing a vaccine have been accelerated. I can tell you one way in which the process has been accelerated compared to earlier vaccines. By January of 2020, the full base pair sequence of the entire SARS-CoV-2 virus had been sequenced. We knew the exact sequence of the virus at that time. We've been actually able to follow for specific base pair mutations, amino acid changes, which have been blessedly relatively few thus far. So that actually happened at light speed, and that sped things up. In addition, there was a panel at the National Institutes of Health called Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines, and looked at what are the processes in the development and then the proving of the safety and efficacy, that is to say the demonstration of the fact that you have a vaccine. And if you look here, they go step by step and look at what are the various pieces that you can fast track, develop a collaborative streamlined forum to identify preclinical treatments, so that's discovery, accelerate clinical testing of the most promising vaccines. So if you look at what do you really need to get out of the data, can you construct your clinical trials to accelerate the process without sacrificing the need to get both the safety and the efficacy requirement, and then enhance the effectiveness of clinical trials, which is almost always recruiting, and then finally accelerate the evaluation that would allow for the rapid authorization or approval. And in this, there was work and interplay with the FDA to look at what should the requirements be for emergency use authorization, EUA, and for full FDA approval for vaccines. And I have to say I heartily endorse the job that has been done both by the NIH and at the FDA and by industry to develop absolutely applicable, solid, and rigorous clinical scientific standards for the development of vaccines, for the testing of vaccines, for the review of the data in the clinical testing, so that we can have confidence, I believe, in the process of developing these vaccines, manufacturing these vaccines, and bringing these vaccines to market. So this is a chart of the current candidates that are advancing through clinical trials and are approaching applications for clinical authorization and availability to patients. And you may recognize the top one, Moderna, which you will also hear called Cambridge because Moderna is in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I don't know whether it's BioNTech or BioNTech, I've heard both pronounced, which is the partner for Pfizer, and those two are in the lead. They're both interesting vaccines in that they are mRNA vaccines, so that instead of using old techniques where you use a modified virus or a virus vehicle to cause the body to have an immune response, you actually use mRNA, which is encapsulated to allow it to be absorbed into the antigen-presenting cells of the immune system, and those immune system cells translate the mRNA, express the antigen, and cause the immune system to develop the antigen. It is novel. It had not been previously successful, but we'll take a look at where we stand currently on those. And then following are some more AstraZeneca, J&J, Janssen, Novavax, and GSK, Sanofi all have soon to follow vaccines that are in development. So I think that everybody here probably heard a week ago today the major announcement by Pfizer for very encouraging results. And I thought it might be worthwhile for this group to go over some of the details of their study. If you want more details, you can Google the Pfizer press release. It'll go over this and additional information. They have enrolled 43,538. So these are not trials. This isn't a few people. 43,500 patients, almost 39,000 of whom had received their second dose of the vaccine candidate as of November 8th. And it's important to note that this is a 2-shot vaccine, and the 2 shots were given separated by 21 days, by 3 weeks. The Data Safety Monitoring Board had a trigger for an interim evaluation that was originally supposed to be at the occurrence of the 62nd case. And by the time they locked in the data for the interim review, there were actually 94 cases of coronavirus in this large group of people that had occurred within the time frame of 7 days after the second dose. So they started counting 7 days after the second dose, because that's the assumption of the timeline of the stimulated immunity from the vaccine. Cases that occurred before that are assumed to have been cases that occurred before the vaccine would have had the chance to be effective. It's important to know that, because if and when you get the vaccine, you should assume, like with your flu vaccine, that the day you get the first shot is not when you will have your immunity, if you get your immunity, but rather 7 days after the second shot. And in this interim data evaluation, there were, as I say, 94 cases, And the press release cited a 90% efficacy. Now, we don't really know what that means about the distribution of the 94 cases. It doesn't necessarily mean that 90% of the cases were in the placebo group, because I'm sure there was some form of statistical transformation, number one. Number two, worrying about 90% when you're at 94 cases and the study won't be concluded until there's 162 cases is probably not a good idea. Let's get all the data in and let's look at it. But it is an astoundingly high efficacy compared to what was expected based on what we've seen, for example, in seasonal flu vaccines, which go as low as 30% and as high as 80% efficacy on an annual basis, and it may even be broader than that. Yeah, that maybe. So it was actually a pleasant surprise. No significant safety issues were reported. Safety data will continue to be collected, as is efficacy data. Again, 2 doses separated by 21 days. And they have already submitted, no, I'm wrong. They have promised the submission of their emergency use authorization application before the end of November, maybe by the end of this week, almost certainly in the week that follows, if not by the end of this week. Full FDA review, so now we're getting into timeline. So they haven't even submitted for emergency use authorization. Once they submit for emergency use authorization, the FDA will need to look at all the data, review the data, turn it sideways and headlong. They will need to decide whether the data is adequate to make an emergency use authorization, and if so, does the data substantiate that? It is really hard to get a timing on that. If it happened in 2 weeks, it would be amazingly fast. Most people put that review process in the 2 to 4 week category. So if we assume, let's just say, today's the 16th, next Monday's the 23rd, say by November 25th the application is in, then you could safely assume that you would see some action on the application in the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th week of December, which is the point at which there would be permission given to apply outside of a clinical trial setting this vaccine to the general public. One of the things that Operation Warp Speed has done is to take the manufacturing piece out of the timeline, which is to say, if in normal development of any pharmaceutical, if you were doing the clinical trials, you would manufacture for the needs of the clinical trials until you had adequate data to believe that you had a product that you would be able to sell, and then you would start to ramp up manufacturing to sell that product based on your projections, but you would not pedal to the metal, start manufacturing as much as possible. Manufacturing at risk says, we believe we have adequate information that this is going to work, and we will take on the risk of the expense of manufacturing large quantities. And this is where you might have heard a little bit of different stories. Was this an Operation Warp Speed project or not? The entire research and development project was undertaken outside of Project Warp Speed. The funding for manufacturing at risk was funding that came from Operation Warp Speed budget, but Pfizer manufactured at their own risk with a contract to produce 50 million vaccine doses in 2020 and up to 1.3 billion doses in 2021. In essence, they have a contract to sell already. So the manufacturing risk is mitigated by a contract to sell. The biggest issue that I see with this coming out of the gate is that it requires minus 70 degrees centigrade storage, which is not necessarily uniformly available at your local CVS. And there are probably minus 70 degree freezers at your local hospital clinics, but they're probably not in the local hospital clinics. They're probably in the research department, or not necessarily conveniently located for the storage of vaccines that you'll need to go to on a back-to-back-to-back basis as you inject people. So that will need to be worked out. First doses administered outside of clinical trials expected again approximately mid-December. Now, just to show you how quickly things are moving in this space today, it was actually last night, Moderna, Cambridge, announced results of their phase 2/3 trial with more than 30,000 participants, 100 clinical research sites in the United States participating in the study that was launched July 27th. And they had an interim analysis. They had 95 cases of symptomatic COVID among their volunteers, and their data safety monitoring board reported that the candidate was safe and well tolerated, and they noted a vaccine efficacy rate of 94.5%, which they calculated from the fact that 90% of the cases were in the placebo group and 5 in the vaccinated group. Again, I would not memorize 90 and 94.5. In my years in drug development, you would never consider a press release like this, because if the numbers change, once you put these numbers in public, you're kind of locked into a number. Whether it goes up or down, then you have some explaining to do. So I wouldn't what I would focus on, these are really high efficacy numbers in back-to-back large clinical trials with mRNA vaccines that appear to demonstrate efficacy in prevention of COVID disease, and that is fabulous news. No information was provided regarding timing of submission for their EUA, but you would think that it'll take them a couple days to put the package together. It took, I think it took Pfizer 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks. So if you just assume 2 to 3 weeks starting now, they'll probably be still a couple of weeks behind Pfizer for their EUA. All of the other things that we've just discussed will be in place. So probably before the end of the year, first patients outside of clinical trials will be getting this vaccine. The small disadvantage of this vaccine is that it's a 28-day period instead of a 21-day period between the 2 shots. It is 2 shots. The really significant, potentially significant commercial advantage is that it requires minus 20-degree centigrade storage, which is pretty much a really damn good freezer. Should be able to keep your specimens at minus 20. The next really controversial topic is who will get the vaccine and how. And the answer to that is I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. The political machinations going on right now are going to have a pretty substantial impact on how that will go, but there are Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices for COVID-19 Vaccination Implementation, which is another one of the NIH umbrella processes, published in JAMA on October 22nd, again, since the last time we met, that there are 3 recommended phases. That would be a phase 1A, where healthcare personnel are inoculated. The estimate in this article was there are about 20 million healthcare personnel, but that all depends on how you define a healthcare personnel, and other people have estimated as high as 35 million healthcare personnel. And if you'll remember, when we looked at the Pfizer slide, that they were promising up to 50 million doses, which is 25 million people if you get two shots. So the entire 2020 allocation of the Pfizer vaccine could go to healthcare personnel only. Phase 1B is then essential workers, which are frontline workers, first responders, as well as persons with high-risk underlying medical conditions and elderly individuals, which if you start tallying that up, that's 150 million, and now you're starting to count who's not as opposed to who is, and then phase 2, a full rollout. This article was really about discussing the ethical implications of how you decide. Where we are really kind of in the dark, even if you can decide on a mechanism by which you will allocate who gets in line first and who doesn't, not a trivial exercise for 330 million people, how you actually go about getting it to those people and how you do it in an equitable fashion, especially in the middle of a pandemic that has been outrepresented in places where healthcare services are underrepresented. Meatpacking plants, prisons, nursing homes, inner city communities where you don't necessarily have the infrastructure, certainly for a minus 70-degree freezer. This remains to be determined. Currently, there is a fellow who was promoted from colonel to general in the U.S. Army to take over the logistics of planning how to distribute this. To be frank, this is the kind of undertaking. The immunization of the American public is the kind of undertaking that we haven't really seen since operations like D-Day in World War II. It is that kind of an operation. So it does not trouble me at all, the notion that there would be a military presence involved in the logistics of administering. That is personal opinion. Everybody's entitled to their own, and it is not yet clear how we will go about. So that when you hear about there's a vaccine and it's right, there are vaccines, there's data, approvals are coming, product will be out there, and it will be getting to the public. But I think best case scenario of having hundreds of millions of people vaccinated, if you got your first 150 million to 200 million people vaccinated by April 1st, that would be some really, really good work. It's just not a trivial exercise. This is a slide demonstrates my complete boomer incapacity at slide making. This is now an old slide. It's at least 6 weeks old. But it shows it could be a slide for general immunity to viruses. It shows that you get T cells, which is cellular immunity, actually are activated first. Then you get the early antibodies, IgM and IgA, before what is considered to be the neutralizing antibody, the effective antibody, IgG. This gives you a timeline on that, and it really does look like standard textbook immunology, and it gives you the times. But it also shows you that these are not static things. They come and go, and that will explain for you why you might get different results if you measured the same individual or you measured a collection of individuals and you measure over time. Antibodies could come and go. And if your limit of detection, if the amount of antibody is near the limit of detection of your test, on a 7-day period, if you have a sensitive test, your test could go plus, minus, plus, minus, plus, minus on back-to-back days, further complementing testing issues. I will tell you that both of the two vaccines that we just discussed have demonstrated both cellular, that is to say the CD4 and CD8 T cells, and humoral, that is to say the antibodies, the IgG antibodies. Those responses were demonstrated, which was what gave them the first positive inclination of the efficacy, which has now been, has started to be demonstrated in the clinical trials. There was, among the people that did respond to my request for topics, there was a significant amount of interest in herd immunity. I've got a lot of text-dense slideage here. Herd immunity, essentially, in its rawest form, would be cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Don't do anything. Let the virus hit the streets. Let people get the virus. Let people get their own native immunity, and then we'll see what happens. And the problem with that is that we're actually seeing a hybrid form of herd immunity in many of those states that are hot spots, that don't have mask mandates, that did not have quarantining, that did not close businesses down. And the problem is that the fatality rate will go up dramatically if your healthcare system is overwhelmed. You will not get the kind of care the president got for your average Joe coming off the street if there's no hospital beds, if there's no protective equipment for the people that will man the hospital beds, or woman the hospital beds, or person the hospital beds. The healthcare system being overwhelmed is what it looked like in Bergamo, Italy, and in New York at the very beginning, and the risk of having hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of casualties is very, very high with herd immunity. And Marie, this slide deck will be available, right? Yes. Let me do a time check. We're almost done. I don't want to keep people too far beyond. Should we continue for a few more minutes? You can read it for yourself. The notion is, however, that if you can get a significant percentage of your population immune, either through natural immunity or through vaccination, then the rate of spread of the virus will drop substantially and you can move towards resuming natural life. This has been accomplished. It's been accomplished with measles, for example. And you know what happened with measles? It was done with vaccination. And then the anti-vax movement came around and people got lax. And most of you in this room, with the exception of a couple of us, have never seen a case of measles and don't know what it looked like and didn't see people die or with brain damage. And so people thought, well, the vaccine is worse than the disease. And now we're seeing outbreaks again for a viral disease we thought we'd eliminated, smallpox. Not dissimilar. Now, those are two examples of viruses for which herd immunity might actually work, because the evidence is strong that once you have immunity, it is lifelong, or at least decades long. And the problem that we have with our vaccines is we do not know how long the immunity will be from the vaccines, nor do we know how long the immunity exists that you get naturally. And I think I took this up in a slide a little bit down.
Dr. Simmons, I don't know if you're going to mention the entire country of Sweden that tried this herd immunity experiment,
Yes,
and having somewhat now of a failure rate as their cases are rising.
yes,
Very different country, but this is the approach they tried.
Yeah, so Sweden got a little bit of political liability to it, and thank you. Please jump in with questions, because the numbers in Sweden are actually better than some of the other numbers in some of the other countries like Spain or Italy, except those are not the comparator countries. Sweden is a total stinking mess if you compare it to Norway, if you compare it to Finland, if you compare it to Denmark, and if you compare it to Germany, where they took both public health and personal health measures and squashed it. Sweden is order of magnitude worse than those countries, so I agree with you. Sweden was a tough experiment. The other experiment was Russia, where they did absolutely nothing, but you can't use that, or Iran. You can't really use those because you don't have any data or any numbers that are reliable. Brazil is another country where you can see what will happen with herd immunity. Herd immunity is not a choice for an ethical and compassionate society. It is not a pretty way to go. It is not even remotely considered acceptable. The trouble with herd immunity, from the Mayo Clinic website: even if infection creates long-lasting immunity, a large number of people would have to become infected. If it were 70% of the population, that's 230 million people, even if you use low fatality rates, 0.5%, that's a lot of people that are going to die. And where I want to get to from there is dying may not be the worst thing that could happen to you if you get this disease. A significant number of people have significant morbidity who recover from the disease. And this slide was just a couple weeks ago, again, since our last meeting, a morbidity mortality weekly report. Everybody hears about the people that are dying are people, older people, obese people, people with hypertension, men, smokers, and all of that is true. But when you break it down to excess expected mortality, the highest rate, it's the bolded sentence, the average percentage change in death, if you compare year-on-year mortality by age band, the highest bump is for people 25 to 44. Because you don't expect to die when you're 30 years old. Worse than that, so at the highest proportion, a 26.5% increase year on year in fatalities was in that age range. I think the other thing that you have to realize is that although the fatality rates are probably an order of magnitude lower in that age range than they are, say, in the octogenarian or nonagenarian, certainly in those populations, the people that aren't dying are not necessarily throwing away their crutches and dancing down the aisles. They have stroke, they have lung disease, they have heart disease, they have nerve disease, they have kidney disease, that's to say if those organs were affected, and many people are reporting what we are calling long COVID or long haulers, where 3 months after their disease, they are still functionally dramatically impaired compared to where they were, without necessarily showing a stroke or persistent lung disease. They are just fatigued and overwhelmed by the virus. So the public health implications of this pandemic are really problematic. So we've already covered the reduction in mortality is actually pretty substantial, and I think there are a couple of things. One is that we're no longer looking at a virus-naive population, and the age distribution has shifted substantially to the left. But let's not take away from the valiant efforts of people on the front line of treating this disorder. They have learned immense amounts about how to ventilate people who have COVID pneumonia. They figured out that large doses of steroids for an inflammatory pneumonia are beneficial. There are a lot of small incremental changes in care that have resulted in substantial diminution in mortality of this disorder. This is where we come back to the problem with herd immunity. That fatality rate will skyrocket again if you can't get in the hospital, if you don't even go to the hospital because you're afraid, or if the hospital is overwhelmed and the high-tech, high-quality care is not available, the fatality rates will skyrocket again. And we've already been there, reduced mortality treatments. I don't need to go to the NIH website again. There is a rapid, actually I will, what the heck. There is a rapid development program for therapeutics, non-vaccine therapeutics, and it focuses on immune modulators. They have not been, there was a moment when everybody thought this might be an immune, cytokine storm. I actually think that most people believe that organ damage in this disease now is an arteriolitis. It is this disease of the small blood vessels, and it is more a thromboembolic disease of small blood vessels than it is a cascade of immune response. And these have not really panned out. But outpatient monoclonal antibodies, I'll take a minute to talk about. Inpatient monoclonal antibodies, I'll take a minute to talk about. Antithrombotics, there was actually an article that showed an aspirin was statistically significant in reducing mortality and morbidity in this disorder, going back to the notion of platelet clumping and arteriolar occlusion may be the mechanism of organ system damage in this disorder. And then there are companies that are looking for big effects, that is to say, are there drugs on the shelf or drugs that can be developed? Because to be frank, we've talked a lot about immunity, and the conclusion we're coming to is that we may or may not be able to rely on it. Really getting back to a world that we used to know, if you developed a drug that when you get the disease, you could cure the disease with a high probability, that would be the, quote, magic bullet that everybody would be looking for. So the last topic, you've heard a little bit about, or a lot about monoclonal antibodies, because both the president and I think Chris Christie got monoclonal antibodies as part of their treatment. So right now, there are a number of companies with monoclonal antibodies. Again, these are antibodies to the spike protein, which is what the IgG that you develop in response with natural immunity is. The spike protein is the viral particle, the part of the viral coat that binds to the ACE receptors in the airways and allows the virus to enter the cells and infect an individual. Eli Lilly is furthest along in monoclonal antibodies, and the good news is that they have received EUA authorization a week ago based on the results of their BLAZE-1 trial, which showed significant reduction in progression of disease for patients 12 years or older, greater than 40 kilograms, at high risk for progression of disease or hospitalization. The problem is it is an IV infusion. It takes about an hour to get the IV drip of the antibodies. And the other problem is that the inpatient trials have shown pretty much futility. They stopped what is called their active 3 trial because there was no benefit shown. People already in the hospital getting these antibodies were really not benefiting. So it is the sooner after you get the disease, the better you will react to the infusion of these antibodies. And the other problem is that the U.S. government has purchased as many doses as Lilly can make available to them. That's 300,000 doses. We have 11.1 million cases. We're seeing 170,000 new cases a day. 300K doses are not going to go very far. Regeneron, which is the antibody that President Trump got, is a cocktail of 2 monoclonal antibodies to the spike protein. They announced similar kind of results on an outpatient study of 524 patients, 57% reduction in medical visits and a tenfold reduction in viral load. I don't know how they measured that. They have not yet submitted their application for EUA. It's expected to come soon. They actually had a trial that was enrolling in inpatient. My understanding is that we do not expect to see a benefit in inpatient in the Regeneron product, which takes us to convalescent plasma, which is not dissimilar in that the earlier that it's used, the more likely you are to show an effect. But the truth of the matter is it has been very difficult to show a substantive effect of convalescent plasma, which is also not a treatment to lay too much confidence on in the future because it's hard to come by. If you remember, the antibodies disappear within weeks or months after they appear, and the high titer plasma appears to be the plasma that is, if you have an effect, is going to produce an effect. So these are treatments. The monoclonal antibodies and the convalescent plasma are treatments. They are treatments that have a benefit early on in the disease. Remdesivir, this is the last thing I'm going to make you guys sit through. Virtually within days of each other, the news reports had the FDA approved remdesivir, and the WHO said that remdesivir didn't work. And I've put on the slide here the information that I needed to rationalize this. The WHO trial was essentially an open-label trial of remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, with ritonavir or interferon regimens. It was a large, bulky, and cumbersome trial that, to be honest, was not powered to distinguish an effect. And they did actually have a 0.95 risk ratio, but it didn't achieve statistical significance. And so they concluded there was no evidence of remdesivir working. There is a ton of evidence to suggest that remdesivir works, including a publication in the New England Journal that came out last week entitled Remdesivir for the Treatment of COVID-19, a Final Report, a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial of over 1,000 patients, and remdesivir reduced recovery time from 15 days to 10 days. And the mortality data there actually is very interesting. It may also help to explain the WHO's trial futility. It's point-in-time fatality doesn't tell you much about a disease where people are dying and recovering every day and new patients are coming in. So they actually looked at fatality rates at 15 days and showed a statistically significant reduction from 11.9 to 6.7%. At 29 days, there was a reduction in fatality from 15.2 to 11.4, which did not quite achieve significance. And again, the longer you go out, the more futility you see, and the harder it will be to demonstrate a fatality benefit. But overall, I believe that remdesivir as an IV drug for hospitalized patients with COVID pneumonia has been proven to have a beneficial effect for patients and may be contributing to improvements in mortality that we're seeing as we move through time. This last slide, the piece on the left is just to show you what are the recommendations of the British Medical Journal for their primary care for providers for what they're calling long COVID. And it's a pretty decent catalog of the different things that people are seeing and what needs to be followed. And from last week's MMWR, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Reports, if you have an interest in public health, you should follow MMWR. They analyzed 126,000 patients, and they showed a 15% mortality rate from initial hospitalization. So those are hospitalized patients. But more frighteningly, 15% of patients were discharged to a skilled nursing facility. 12% of patients needed home health care, and 7% were discharged to home or self-care. So there's lots of good news, but we are in for a couple of very dark and difficult months. There's a lot of fatigue out there. Everybody wants to have their old lives back. You can't have your old life back, not yet. But there's an immense amount of amazing basic and clinical science going on. Things are getting better, and well, let's see again come the spring when we get out of the seasonal virus season and see where we stand. And thanks for your kind attention, and I'm sorry I kept you late and kept people from dinner. Thank you.
That was incredible. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's
You
a
put a
pleasure.
lot of time and effort into that. It
I did.
definitely showed. Thank you. And it was really, really informative. So the data that you presented, the vaccines, herd immunity, treatments, were extremely valuable.
I'm glad I could be helpful. Thanks.
Guess
Now-
my question, I didn't know, like, so if somebody's had COVID maybe 4 to 6 months ago, I guess they're going to have to figure out, do they get a booster shot, or how that all is going to
Damn
pan
fine
out?
question. So at the beginning, everybody thought, well, you get the disease and you got a golden ticket because you're immune. And it actually took until August for the first credible cases of reinfection to appear. Now there are a multitude of cases of reinfection. The earliest reinfection that I see documented is at 6 weeks. So as opposed to having a test that might be a stuttering test, reinfection, well defined, is an individual gets a syndrome that is documented to be COVID, recovers completely, and then gets a syndrome that is documented to be COVID again, and that recovery includes virological recovery. The earliest 6 weeks, but that kind of gives the lie. That was one of the earliest signs that I took for the evidence that people do get immunity when they get infected, was the fact that we had tens of millions of people worldwide, and it took 6 months for the first reinfection case to come in. Coronaviruses in general are not new. We do know that coronaviruses do induce immunity, and it is not lifelong immunity. That is to say, the non-SARS, MERS coronaviruses. The assumption has been that that immunity is 9 to 15 months. Some people say 6 to 12, because you almost never get a seasonal cold, which coronaviruses are 30% of seasonal colds, from the same coronavirus when you look closely in the same season, but it's not at all uncommon to get a seasonal cold with the same coronavirus in the following season. So if this behaves as coronaviruses, then we are looking at if immunization becomes a significant proportion of the way we deal with it, which I think we have to assume that will be the case, we're probably looking at a seasonalized process for combating the virus. Great question. There are so many questions about immunity, and once you start having general inoculation in the public, now testing becomes a very different issue. And next time we could talk about testing, because it was such a muck-up at the beginning. It's actually starting to settle out now, and there are going to be better tests, more rapid and more reliable tests coming.
Yeah. I do know that there are companies working with the CDC to try to figure out the very question out. What does that immunity level look like? What test can get us that number that we need? Because a lot of the antibody tests are pos-neg. There are some out that are quantitative, semi-quantitative, so that's still coming. They're working on it.
Yeah,
They're working on it.
it was actually a Nature article where they looked at all of the different epitopes and that are measured, and they actually put together a package for, if you measure 3 of them, you'll have the best chance of actually diagnosing active viral disease. It looks like there are going to be lateral flow. Those are the kind of pregnancy tests for cellular immunity as well as for antibodies. And remember, when you're measuring these PCRs, polymerase chain reaction, you're measuring mRNA, which does not necessarily mean an infectious viral particle, which is another problem that you have with tracking this. It could be a fragment or a remnant from a previous infection. They've actually turned that to advantage, because one of the very interesting things I saw was for population-based tracking and prediction, measuring the level of mRNA in wastewater, in the sewage water, has been shown to be a really effective way of tracking community density of population. So there's so much going on. I'm totally overwhelmed. Thanks, Peter.
Well, thank you so much again. It was an incredible, informative
pleasure.
talk, so thank you.
Thanks.
All right, any other questions? Thank you, everybody, for staying. So if there's no other announcements or questions, we're going to adjourn this meeting. And our next meeting is on Monday, December 21st at 5:30, and location to be determined, correct? So thank you, everybody.